Hello once again, my fellow Jeti users, and welcome back to my workshop. And in today's video, we're going to take a look at the transmit frequency and servo output period, because I get asked questions about this from time to time, and somebody again asked today if I could help clear up confusion. So hopefully I shall try and make things less confused, not more confused. Let's dive in and have a look. We go into our menu, into System, Configuration. Down here there is the transmit frequency, and the choices are 100 Hz or 50 Hz. Hopefully your transmitter is set at 100 Hz when you get it, but do go in here and check and set it to 100 Hz. This is how frequently the transmitter and the receiver talk to one another. 100 Hz, 100 times a second. It's sending out a new frame of data for your servo positions, etc., to the receiver. Do not use 50 Hz except in one very special circumstance. Why has Jeti put it in there? It's there to provide backwards compatibility with the very old original Jeti receivers that do not have the menu option to set the output period. And we'll have a look at the receiver's output period in a moment. All Jeti receivers that have been sold for quite a long time now, you can set the output period, that is, how rapidly the servos get a new bit of data, quite independent from this transmit frequency. But if you have the very old original Jeti receivers in which there is no menu option to set the output period, then that receiver is just going to pass on the transmit frequency to the servos, which means the servos are going to get a refresh rate of 100 Hz or 50 Hz. That is, if you prefer it in timings, 10 milliseconds or 20 milliseconds. In other words, once every 10 milliseconds, once every 20 milliseconds. And analog servos, as a general rule, cannot cope with a refresh rate of 100 Hz or 10 milliseconds. And that means if you were to use the 100 Hz setting with the very original Jeti receiver where you could not set the output period, it would be outputting 100 Hz or 10 millisecond refresh rate to the servos, and analog servos generally cannot cope with that and they get damaged. So Jeti included 50 Hz in here so you could reset your transmitter to work with the very old receivers and analog servos. If you're using the very old receiver and all digital servos, then you can run at 100 Hz, because generally digital servos can run with a 100 Hz, i.e. every 10 millisecond refresh. So if you're wondering why the 50 Hz is there, that's why. Only use it if you are running the very original Jeti receivers that don't have an output period with an analog servo. Otherwise, set it to 100 and just leave it there. We'll cope with whether you're using analog or digital servos in the receiver's output period. Okay, let's have a look at the receiver's output period then. We come up to Model, into its Device Explorer, into our receiver. And into its advanced properties in this case. Right, here we are. Output period. Jeti tends to default to an output period 57 Hz, which is 17.5 milliseconds. Take a look. You can wind all the way up to that, which is very slow, or all the way down to there, and auto. What does auto mean? You might think that it means the receiver is very intelligent and it can automatically work out what kind of servos you've got and adjust the output period to suit. Wrong, it doesn't. What auto does is pass on that transmit frequency that you've set. So if you've set it to 100 Hz, and you really should, what auto will do is pass on a refresh rate of 100 Hz or once every 10 milliseconds to the servos. Now, if every servo you've got in your plane is digital, that's probably okay, because digitals in general can handle that sort of refresh rate. But if you've got even one analog servo in your plane, that's going to be bad news for it. So as a general rule, it's better to avoid auto. Have a think about what refresh rate your plane needs and set it manually. Okay. Now, the output period has to suit the slowest refresh rate servo in your plane. As a general rule, analog servos were designed in the days when the good old-fashioned megahertz radios, AM and FM and PCM, and they ran at a refresh rate generally of 50 hertz. That's 50 times a second, in other words, once every 20 milliseconds. And that's what the old original PPM system was designed for. And basically, we may have these lovely advanced 2.4 gigahertz digital radios, but the servos are still basically taking that old PPM signal. And an analog servo was designed around passing a pulse of power to the motor at that rate. 50 hertz, once every 20 milliseconds, that's what analog servos like. Digital servos don't use the sort of incoming pulse to pulse the motor. They do it quite independently. The electronics in there will run the motor at a much higher pulse frequency than the incoming data, which is why digital servos tend to hum and ring, because you're actually hearing the ringing pulse being sent to the motor. And they can cope with getting data much faster, like that, 100 hertz, 10 milliseconds, or you get some of these very specialized helicopter tail rotor servos, which are designed to run from their dedicated gyro, and they can run very high rates. So if you try and run an analog servo at a high rate like this, you are very likely to do it some damage, and it may not be apparent immediately. It might take it many minutes before it finally gives up, and you could be in the middle of a flight when it does it. So even if it appears to be working okay on the bench, just don't risk it. If there's just one analog servo in your plane, you need to be using the 17.5 or 20 milliseconds output period. Then that analog servo will be happy. Doesn't matter if you've got 23 digital servos and one analog servo, you have to set the output period to suit that analog servo. Is there any disadvantage to running digitals at that refresh rate? Well, in terms of harm, no. It will not do them the slightest bit of harm running at that slow refresh rate. It's just that they can cope with a higher data refresh rate. What's the point of the higher data refresh rate? Well, the servo is going to respond that fraction more quickly to your controls. You know, if it gets updated every 10 milliseconds instead of once every 20 milliseconds, then it's going to respond 10 milliseconds earlier. That's 10 thousandths of a second faster, which is 1/100th of a second faster. Can you notice that? Unless you're a really top flyer flying these wild helicopter maneuvers, I doubt most of us, your average club flyer, could actually tell the difference. But if you like to do it, there you go. So to be honest, I just tend to leave everything at the Jeti's default 17.5, even if I'm running digitals. Am I really going to notice a difference? Probably not, to be honest, pottering about. Even with my jets, I don't notice the difference. And sometimes it'd be nice if Jeti were like the fabulous Weetronic gizmo receivers. I used to run Weetronic on my multiplex. And these Weetronics gizmo receivers, you could set the output period for every single output independently. So you could set it to a digital servo or an analog per output socket. But they were big, heavy receivers. They had loads of regulation stuff in them as well. And Jeti isn't into making that sort of size beast unless you're into a central box 400. So anyway, all of the output period has to go to the output period will be sent to all sockets similarly. You can't select it per socket. Just one more thought. You might think, aha, well, what if I am using the alternative pin config and, I've set this to, say, X bus as my output because it's a satellite receiver and it's feeding into a main receiver, or I've got satellites feeding into a central box. What do I set it to there? Well, actually, it doesn't make any difference. The output period here that you set goes to, change it back to what I will be using. The output period here goes to the sockets on the receiver that feed a servo. It is not changing the X bus output. So when you're setting up your, in Europe we tend to use the RSAT, or you're setting up Rex 3s or your assist feeding into another receiver into your central box, the setting you put here will have no effect on what goes down the X bus cable to your central box or your primary receiver. So it doesn't matter about setting them there. The X bus stream is sent down the cable without modification, so it will go at 100 Hertz and it will not carry fail-safe data. And that's why you have to set the fail-safe and the output period in the central box or in the primary receiver. If you're using a little satellite hanging off that receiver, it has to be done in the main receiver. Okay, so to recap, set your transmitter's transmit frequency at 100 Hertz and just leave it there, except in the very special circumstance that you need to operate a model that has a very old Jeti receiver that does not have an output period setting, and you've got at least one analog servo attached to it. Otherwise, just set it to 100 Hertz transmit frequency and leave it there. Set the output period in the receiver to suit the type of servos. If you've got just even one analog servo in your model, use the output period of 17.5 or 20 milliseconds. If every servo in your model is digital, you can leave it at 17.5 or 20 milliseconds. If you want, you can run it at a faster rate, like 100 Hertz, 10 milliseconds, maybe even faster if your servos would suit. But to be honest, you're getting into realms there if you need to contact the manufacturer and get them to tell you what's the maximum refresh rate their servo can cope with. And funnily enough, they don't tend to bother giving that information. So if you've got all digitals and you're desperate to have the fastest response, run them at 100 Hertz, 10 milliseconds. But as I say, I doubt most of us could tell the difference. So hopefully that's cleared that up a little bit for you.